Hey everyone, welcome to Inside Gaming. Today we're reviewing Void Bastards. Yes, it's been out for a while, sorry, E3 threw everything off, but hey, there's always time for good opinions with good gamers, and that's what we got here. So Zach, you put in the most time on this. I only played it for a couple hours. So how long have you played this?
I've put about 10 hours into Void Bastards, and I gotta say, fuck E3, forget the Avengers, drop Sinin Kagura. Void Bastards game of the year, easily. I'm in love with Void Bastards.
Every game we've reviewed so far has been game of the year. This can't keep happening.
This is my first review for us, and I'm telling you, Void Bastards game of the year 2019.
Putting their chips down.
So good.
Okay, so real quick, some brief background on this. This is from some of the talent that's made some very popular games, right? I think I heard BioShock.
Yeah, development director of BioShock and System Shock 2, and and unlike a lot of games where people say that the same developer works on something else and it's just like rehashing the same thing. You can feel the DNA of those games in this game, but it is like entirely something its own. It does not feel like a rehash of BioShock or anything, but when you play it and really get into the game's minute systems, you can feel that DNA alive and at work, and it's kind of a beautiful thing.
So I guess just going off the top, there are a couple of things I think that hit people right away when they start playing. One is sort of the art style, the presentation of it, which is, I think, super cool. It's very like classic 60s sci-fi comic book stuff, which in a weird way to me also sort of throws back to a different era of shooters. So all the enemies are like 2D cutouts that sort of rotate to face the camera, which is very similar to like how Doom used to work and things like that when they didn't have polygonal enemies. But it also looks like a moving comic book in the way that it has very flat color palettes and stuff like that. So, I don't know, you obviously put more time into it. What are your thoughts about how the game's presented?
Yeah, you're right. It's like a cel-shaded kind of comic book crossover, and the way that the enemies are presented is that 2D kind of like exist on only one plane at a time. The presentation also varies. It's within each level that you do. So it's procedurally generated. The whole shtick of the game is that you land on a ship, and that's like your level for that one instance. The ship like designs vary, and some of them, like you walk in and the power's off, or there's smoke everywhere, like things are broken, or there's the janitors forgot to collect the trash. And so the actual presentation of the game varies depending on what level you're in. And it is super kind of like tells a story in the actual, like, it's like environmental storytelling, but not in like an eye-rolly way. It's like when you walk into the ship and everything's pitch black, you're like, I gotta fix this. But it looks beautiful doing it. And it's like such an effective way to actually like get you into like each level shtick, because like a thing that I feel with procedurally generated stuff sometimes is that things seem to meander and that there's like not really a point to why this thing is here. And they somehow fix that with just a simple kind of like change of a layout and like the way that they like package it to you. It's
interesting.
Super refreshing.
So yeah, you mentioned it does have elements of roguelike to it. So every time that you play a session or whatever, they basically roll a new character, which is I guess a convict that's getting released and like sent out into the galaxy to just do menial tasks that no one else wants to do. But those characters have their own attributes each time, right? And you have to kind of learn a character, learn their strengths and weaknesses as you play. I remember the first one I had, it may start the same way every time, but I had a guy who was like addicted to smoking, so he just coughed randomly.
That was what I started, so yeah, I think you're right. It might be, exactly.
But yeah, the cough like alerts enemies and it hurts you. So I saw other ones where like there was a character that was way too formal, so it only referred to everything by their last name. And that's everything, like every enemy, every item was like Mr. or Mrs. something. And it's just like weird, quirky bits of kind of almost dark humor that they inject into the game through those randomly generated things. Which is, that's kind of a new, like when you play a roguelike, every new start is kind of a breath of fresh air, like, oh, there's so many possibilities for this run, and then you just die immediately. But I did like that there's a lot of, like you said, more narrative and story elements pushed in that really play with your imagination and help you sort of think about the headspace of the game more than just trying to beat this level. But to that point though, so you mentioned that you go to different ships and each ship kind of has its own story that it tells. Is there an overarching story beyond that, or is the goal just to get to the end of the roguelike?
So there is an overarching story. There's not much of one. It kind of ties into the game's sense of humor, which, to be clear, this game is very funny. Like, it's a really funny, very dark, dry sense of humor. It's very like British. Without giving any spoilers, it kind of just revolves around you never being good enough. So like they like you said, it hits me a little too close to home, just right between the eyes there. But the essentially like you like you said, you're a convict. that is trying to get their sentence lessened. So they send you out on these, random tasks, and they're so like, oh, go get the HR computer. You need to go get the HR computer. So you go get all the stuff. You bring the the components back. You build the HR computer, and then you boot up the computer, and then oh no, like there wasn't enough. There wasn't like a cooling fan in the computer, so it explodes. And they're like, oh, darn it. Well, I guess we gotta go find a cooling fan now. And like, that's how the story is laid out to you. It's essentially just this, and it sounds depressing, and it sounds like very crushing because you just put because the game is hard. Like, Void Bastards is a hard game. I hate to admit that I had to bump it down on the difficulty because I was...
Gamer cred ruined.
It is like, it is an oppressive game, and honestly it's dark and tense, and like and sometimes it's like very scary, like and not just in the presentation, but like in the way that it like positions you within this world where you're like, okay, like basically like between ships you're on this overworld like hub map, kind of think like Mario, going from 1-1 to 1-2, and you have to expend fuel and food to make a move on the board, essentially. So you can't go anywhere without like depleting your very, very valuable resources. And
you scavenge those back from the ships, right?
Right. So, but if you're not planning ahead, and you're not like preparing for like how many jumps you might have to make, they call them jumps to get from one ship to another. If you're not preparing for how many jumps you have to make until you get to a ship that has that resource, you'll just die. Like, you just die, and like the game kind of throws you up the middle finger at you, and you starve to death if you run out of food. And it's like a very like thing. They make no qualms about showing you that you fucked up and it's your fault. So yeah.
Great. Is it more harsh than most roguelikes? Because roguelikes sort of revel in the fail state, pushing you towards it over and over and over again, until you get that one magic run where everything is right, like you find the right weapons, you get the right character, and then you push all the way to the end. So is that roughly the flow of this game too?
Yes. However, you brought up the idea of each convict has their own, attributes, and they do drastically affect your run through. And in later levels, you can do a gene therapy and change your attributes out. But ironically enough, to your point, it is all about chasing that magic run. But because this game is the game that it is, and it is kind of this dark, dry humor, ironically, the run that I got the farthest on, I spawned with a guy who got really excited about loot and screamed whenever you picked anything up. Yeah, and no, but
really?
It actually exactly sounds just like that. Like, we should put a clip in there. And it was, I didn't find a gene therapy thing to rewrite that attribute until like hour 4 or something. And
so runs can take that long?
Multiple days. I mean, if you're playing for like
So you get really attached to your character, like get to learn his quirks or his or her quirks and stuff like that, and then just bam, dead?
And that actually ties into another interesting point about this game, is that it's surprisingly based on stealth. It's not like you don't have to play it like a stealth game, but you will survive much more fruitfully if you do like practice some restraint and not just like this. Like, this is not a shooter. Like, people have been positioning this as this like action FPS, and it's totally not. It's a strategic like shooter. It's definitely more about like conservation of ammo and like, do I fight or flight? There's enemies in this game that you just straight up like cannot beat with what resources that you have, depending on where you are in your run. So it's just a matter of just saying, do I try to? And there's tons of moments where they have a really cool mechanic where you can lock doors behind you, so you can kind of like aggro. There's this one enemy in the game that's like this, essentially like the Juggernaut, and you just can't beat him at sometimes. And so what you'll do is you can like aggro him into like essentially a broom closet, and then lock him in there. And so you lock one door, run around the entire perimeter of the ship, because a lot of them are in like a circular design. Literally run through hordes of enemies to the other side of that room and lock that door. So you trap the Juggernaut in one tiny room, and then you're like, oh, okay, I can do this entire run without worrying about him because he's locked in there and he's not getting out.
And you talked about how it shares DNA with some of the creative director's work, or development director. It sounds a lot like System Shock 2. So the game is mostly just derelict ships floating in space, right? Which is
That's the entire game.
Yeah, which is a majority of System Shock 2. And then one of the things I noticed is how you can hear most enemies before you can see them, and how that kind of plays into your paranoia about being on these ships that are rickety and busted, and how you're always on the verge of death. And then also even, the survival horror aspect, or the resource management aspect, where based on how your character's spec'd out in System Shock 2, there were a lot of fights that were just not worth taking. I'll just be quiet, that thing's gonna walk through shambling and saying horrible things, and then I'll keep all my bullets and not take damage because it's not worth fighting this thing. It's interesting to hear a lot of those things back in Void Bastards, but in the context of a roguelike, which is kind of interesting. But on that note, so System Shock 2 had some RPG mechanics to it. You could level up your character and things like that. A lot of roguelikes now will have some form of progression to take the edge off of the difficulty as you keep playing. From what I saw, there was a sort of crafting, resource gathering aspect where you could unlock new weapons and gear and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. How does that work out over the long term, though? Do you get just more health? Is it mostly just your knowledge of the game that builds up and helps you, or do you get some fundamental upgrades that actually make the game easier to finish?
Yeah, no, it's that you're absolutely correct. They have long-term progression mechanics that help take that edge off, and if they weren't there, I would argue this game would just be too oppressive.
Really?
But you're correct. There's you can. There's permanent upgrades. You can increase your health. Whenever you unlock a weapon or an item, it stays unlocked for future runs, which actually makes the roguelike is an interesting aspect about it being roguelike, is that sometimes you'll have to make that really tough decision, do I go left and think I can stick out this magic run, or do I go right and get this item that will definitely help me on future runs?
Got it.
But I'll probably die right after it. I had to do that with a certain item it's a weapon that stuns enemies, and just essentially you need it for this game because there's a lot of enemies where you have to do that fight or flight, and you turn a corner, they're there, stun them and run away. But to get it, I had to make that tough decision where I'm if I go right and get this weapon at this ship, I will be out of fuel and I won't be able to make a jump and I will die. But it's worth it. It's so you are constantly doing that back and forth with yourself and trying to figure out, is this next move worth it? And it gives it this weird board game quality where you spend a lot of time in that overworld map just moving your cursor around and being okay, this space is 7 ahead, that's 7 fuel and 8 food, and but again, you can the game is also very logical. For instance, if there's dining ships in the game that are just essentially just giant 5-star restaurants floating through space, and logic would dictate that if you go there, you'll probably get a lot of food, and that's exactly the case. So you'll kind of be okay, 2 ships ahead from now, there's a lot of food, it's a dining ship, so there's probably not many enemies on it. Whereas if you go to a luxury hotel ship, there's dozens and dozens of rooms. There's probably a lot of enemies hiding within these rooms. So it's you're always in that game of logic of how far can I get? Is it worth it? Let me just assess the situation and then make the best step for here, but you never can be too myopic or else you just won't survive.
That's really fascinating. I love games that force difficult decisions. Because a lot of games just there's an obvious right thing and an obvious wrong thing.
Yeah.
I love that this has a lot of valuation to it. How does it feel? You mentioned that the game can be brutally difficult. Does it always feel fair? And I know that it seems to incorporate the unfairness as part of its dark humor, is that you're a disposable human being, so you're just going to get ground up in this universe. But that must be awfully frustrating if you have a really good run and you feel like you've done everything right, and still just through a random snap you get murdered. So does that happen, or when you lose, can you usually think back to some decisions you made that you could have done differently?
Yeah, I mean, there's little snap stuff that'll happen that can absolutely mess you up. You can get randomly mutated with a certain trait, the coughing thing or the screaming thing that just completely is counterintuitive to everything you've been doing for that run. I picked up one on one run where all it did was it was you are unlucky and now you pick up junk. And all of the materials that I was picking up were essentially just useless or the very bare minimum that you could collect. And I was oh, cool, great, unlucky. The trait's called unlucky or something. But then you can also, the inverse is also true, where you can be kind of on the balls of your feet and I don't know what to do, and then you pick up a trait that's oh, you have amazing aim now. And now like the game shooting becomes a lot better. And to your point about, is it fair? Yes, in one word, yes. It's you can have those moments where you trace it back to like, what did I do wrong? What could I do better? But the actual mechanics of the game are very sound. Like it's a completely competent shooter. The difficulty doesn't necessarily come from the moment-to-moment gameplay so much as the strategy and poor planning and mismanagement of resources.
Yeah, on that note, controls, do you have any issues with that? Inventory management or menu navigation? So from my experience, it all seemed pretty sound, pretty straightforward. They did a really good job of making it just complicated enough to have all the systems work together really well, and then movement around the ship was pretty standard like WASD mouse aim, which worked pretty well. I don't know, what are your impressions given that you spent a lot more time with the game?
Yeah, I have no complaints. Controls very well. It's very fluid. Like I said, I had everything just kind of bumped to ultra settings, and so there was no performance issues with anything. Ran silky smooth at 60 the entire time. The actual, I guess my only complaint as far as the way that the weapons kind of management is that you have no way to test weapons and like what they do. So you'll get a new weapon, but you don't necessarily like know
don't
how it
waste
works.
a bullet just seeing how it shoots.
Exactly, right. But like ammo is so scarce a resource that you're like, I only have 3 shots. Like, do I want to use this? So what that would force me to do sometimes is like I'd get low. You choose your loadout before each ship. So you'll be like, okay, well, on this run, I'm like running a little low on bullets, so I'll use like the gun that fires staples. But then like you'll get into that situation where you're like, well, there's the new gun I picked up. I don't know what it does, but I'm gonna do it.
In terms of sound, how do you feel about that? Because from my admittedly limited experience, it did a really good job of setting up just the oppressive atmosphere of everything. For me, mostly it was the enemy design, the fact you can hear them clanking around and muttering and yelling and stuff like that. And even the visual design of like they show you like little comic pop-ups over a door if there's somebody on the other side.
Thud,
exactly.
Step, yeah.
So I thought that was super cool how they both married the audio and visual into the game mechanics and have both of those be tools that you use in addition to creatively supporting the feel of the game. But how do you feel about that in terms of the fact you got much further, saw many more enemies, the music stings and things like that? How does that work for you?
Yeah, you're spot on as far as the sound design is a totally effective way to present these enemies to you, and it really does like ramp up the terror because some of the smaller enemies, like you said, you'll get to a door and just see like the word step, across the threshold, but then you'll be maybe like 2 rooms away from one of the giant enemies, and you hear the like thud, and it is terrifying. It is terrifying. It's like, and it's just a very subtle little thing, but just being able to hear certain enemies from just one room farther does a lot to like really fuck with your sense of place. And then also the music is very very tight. It's nothing I would go like listen to on Spotify, but it's really solid. Where the sound design for me is incredible and really knocks it out of the park is in the voice acting, because not only is your like narrator this very dry, like British like sense of humor, very like Blackadder kind of like. Oh shoot! Like looks like your computer blew up. Time to send you back out there. Like it's very like Douglas Adams. Like humanity was a mistake. But then the enemies are terrifying in some degrees, but they are hilarious. There's one enemy that is essentially just like a 3-foot tall little gremlin that is just a small British person. Like that's how they set it up, and it's like he like runs around the ship and it's like cursing at you in like very Cockney like quips. He's like, you'll be like in a room turning a corner and you'll just hear like, "Oi, dickhead!" and then you're like, whoa, oh shit, there's somebody here, and they'll like swarm you, and they're nothing. Like you can one-shot them and they're gone. So I spend more time just going, huh.
Yeah.
I don't want to shoot you because I want to hear what else you have to say.
So is that like they don't attack you? They just follow you around making noise so other enemies are attracted to you? Is that the idea?
No, they'll attack you. They're just so weak and they're just admittedly hilarious. And so I'm just like, keep some of the voice lines. What else you got for me? Yeah, I got the most common one is they say they call you dickface.
Okay, that's a good one.
In a very British tone. So yeah.
So I know that this is your game of the year, like every game that we review. But are there any problems at all? Can you point to anything that you could have seen done better that you maybe even from your own personal preference you would have liked to see different?
I mean, I think it all comes down to personal gripes. I mean,
Yeah.
like, I think that like maybe a little bit more variety in the ships. They do, like the types of ships do vary. Like I said, there's like a hotel ship or a dining ship or a hospital ship, but the actual like room to room mechanics stay the same throughout the entire game. So it would be cool to see a little bit more variety. They do switch it up. Like once you get deeper into the nebula, you'll start to see a little bit more ship variety. But because the game is designed around this really tight loop, they kind of have to keep the levels consistent so that you can plan for them without ever having been to them.
Got it. That makes sense.
But to be fair though, like in pure Bioshock, System Shock fashion, they still knock it out of the park as far as keeping going down similar hallways fresh, which is totally an accomplishment, and I would have to give it to them for that, because that's not an easy thing to do, to make space hallways exciting for dozens of hours, you know?
Cool. Well, I guess to summarize it up, clearly you really, really like the game, your favorite of the year so far. Who would you recommend this to, though? Is it just blanket everybody should play this, or are there maybe specific tastes, or is it a if you liked Bioshock, play this kind of thing?
I don't even know that a Bioshock fan would by nature latch on to something like this. I think that predisposes you to definitely be more available to like
Maybe
it.
more like Binding of Isaac or something like that?
Yeah, totally. It's a little bit more Binding of Isaac. It's like roguelike fans, I guess, would be a good place to start.
Yeah.
It's so different from a lot of roguelikes I played. Like it's not like I wouldn't say like a Dead Cells fan would necessarily be into this game, and it's not for anyone that is looking for hardcore like FPS action. Like it is not an action FPS. Every bullet is a precious commodity, and you can't, like, if you run around the hallways like shooting, it's not a looter shooter by any means. So yeah, fans of strategy, fans of I think like almost like turn-based systems, and like I could see like RTS fans maybe having a go at this, because that map mechanic is so important to like overview of the little section of the universe that you're in, and that resource management that stems from it is like a huge part of the game.
Cool. Well, thank you for your thoughts. You've encouraged me to go play it more once I ever have a free moment.
That's all I'm out here to do. Just gotta evangelize for it.
Tell us to play video games, and I will. All right, well, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoy Void Bastards. If you have any thoughts, leave them in the comments, and we'll catch you next time. Bye, everybody.
Waiting a long time for the Final Fantasy VII remake. Boy, a really long time. And one of the highlights of E3 was getting a more in-depth look at the game.
And it was really cool.
It was.
We got to see its new combat system, which combined real-time attacks with an active time system to charge up your abilities.
It was great. Plus Tifa was there.
Tifa!
All important parts of Tifa were there.
They scaled her back. She's realistic now.